At being human wasn't just about what they did in battle. It was about what they chose when no one was watching. It was about standing in the gap. As the Astræus prepared to return him home, Daniel looked down at the stone in his palm. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a witness, and maybe that was enough. The ship lifted off silently, leaving the joint station glowing against the black. Below on Kale 7, the first joint memorial was being built. A simple arch, half human steel, half Varelian stone, with one phrase carved in both languages: "We stand so others may live." And as the stars swallowed the moon behind him, Daniel Harris understood something simple and true. The greatest power humanity had was not in its weapons, but in its willingness to protect, even strangers, even enemies, even when no one would ever know. That was the real reason the enemy surrendered, not because they were weak, but because they saw in one quiet human the echo of a courage they could not ignore. People once did, and what they might still become. The fourth day on Kale 7 began with the kind of stillness that comes before a decision. Daniel Harris stood outside the negotiation dome, breathing in the sterile air from his suit's recycler. He hadn't slept. His proposal sat in a sealed pouch at his side, printed on plain paper signed with his name and rank. It wasn't official. It wasn't even authorized. But it was honest. And after everything he'd learned, honesty felt like the only weapon worth using. Inside, the tension was thick. Captain Reyes stood near the coalition table, arms crossed, jaw set. Ambassador Ford sat stiffly, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the arm of her chair. The Varelians were already seated, their expressions unreadable, though Kael'vor's eyes kept drifting toward the entrance as if he knew Daniel was coming. Daniel walked in slowly. All conversation stopped. He didn't go to his usual observer's table. Instead, he stepped into the center of the circle. Every eye followed him. His heart hammered, but his steps were steady. "I have something to say," he began, his voice quiet but clear. Ford opened her mouth to object, but Reyes placed a hand on her arm. Even they knew this moment was different. Daniel took a breath. "I may not be who you think I am," he said, looking first at the Varelians, then at his own people. "I'm not a hero. I've never fought in a major battle. I've never saved a planet. I was sent here to watch, not to speak. But I've learned something these past few days, something my own people forgot." He paused, then continued. 80 years ago, a human ship called the US Marlowe saw a world about to die. It wasn't our world. The people on it weren't human. But the captain, Elias Nunez, chose to stand in the way of destruction anyway. He gave his life so strangers could live. "And your people," he turned to Kael'vor. "You remembered. You honored that act. You built a story around it. And that story, it's kept you from hating us even in war." Kael'vor didn't move, but his eyes gleamed with something like relief. "But we forgot," Daniel went on, voice dropping. "We filed it away as a loss. A mistake. We never knew what really happened. Until now. And now that I know, I can't just sit and watch while we throw away the chance for peace that Captain Nunez bought with his life." He reached into his pouch and pulled out the proposal. "I'm not speaking as a representative of the coalition. I'm speaking as a human. And as a human, I believe we can do better than endless war. So I propose this: joint control of the orbital defense grid, half Varelian, half coalition, monitored by neutral observers, including me, for as long as it takes to build real trust." Silence filled the dome. Even the hum of the air filters seemed to quiet. Then Kael'vor stood. He didn't look at the paper. He looked only at Daniel. "The human speaks with the voice of the shield bearers," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "We yield not to force, but to memory." Ford stood abruptly. "Lieutenant Harris, you had no authority to make this offer." "I know," Daniel said, "but someone had to try." To everyone's surprise, Reyes stepped forward. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "if this works, it ends the war. If it doesn't, we're no worse off than we were yesterday. And maybe the kid's right. Maybe we've been fighting ghosts while forgetting our own." Ford stared at Daniel for a long moment. Then she exhaled slowly. "Fine. But if this fails, the blame falls on you." "I accept that," Daniel said. Kael'vor approached and took the paper. He didn't read it. He simply held it in both hands as if it were sacred. "This is more than a plan," he said. "It is a promise. And we Varelians keep our promises." The rest of the day passed in a blur of discussion, adjustments, and cautious agreement. The Varelians accepted the terms with surprising speed. The coalition, after much debate, agreed to a 30-day trial. Daniel was named temporary overseer of the Joint Monitoring Team, a role that didn't exist before, created on the spot because no one else fit. That evening, as the dome emptied, HFY found Daniel near the exit. "You spoke not as a soldier, but as a guardian," he said. "That is rare." "I just told the truth," Daniel replied. "Truth is the hardest thing to speak in war," HFY said. "You have given us hope. Do not let it fade." Later, alone in his pod, Daniel opened a new message from Captain Cruz. "Well done, Harris. Command is stunned. They're calling it the Marlowe Accord. They want to send a full diplomatic team. But I told them to wait. This is your moment. Don't waste it." He smiled faintly. His moment. It didn't feel grand. It felt fragile, like a single light in a vast dark. But it was real. As he prepared for sleep, he thought of Captain Nunez again, not as a name in a log, but as a man who chose kindness when no one was watching. And Daniel realized something. Courage wasn't always about dying for others. Sometimes, it was about living in a way that honored those who did. The next morning, work began on the Joint Command Station in orbit. Daniel would shuttle up with the first team. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was a bridge. And bridges, he now understood, were built one honest word at a time. The fifth day on KL7 dawned not with tension, but with something quieter, something like trust. Daniel Harris stood on the observation deck of the newly activated Joint Command Station, floating 200 kilometers above the moon's gray surface. Below, the orbital defense grid hummed softly, its weapons powered down, its targeting systems locked under shared control. For the first time in 6 years, no ship scanned the skies for enemies. They watched for peace instead. It had only been a day since the agreement, but already the change was real. Varelian engineers worked side by side with coalition technicians, their differences set aside for the sake of a common system. They didn't speak the same language, but they learned quickly, pointing, gesturing, sharing tools. Daniel moved among them, not as a commander, but as a listener. He answered questions, clarified protocols, and sometimes just stood quietly, letting them see that a human could be present without demanding control. Back on the surface, the Varelians began the slow process of withdrawal from occupied zones, not as defeated soldiers, but as honored partners fulfilling a vow. They left behind supply caches, medical stations, even personal tokens, carved stones, woven cords, small relics of their culture, as gestures of goodwill. The coalition accepted them with cautious respect. The war wasn't over in the records yet, but on the ground it already felt finished. Daniel received a message from Earth Command that morning. It was formal, stiff, full of praise he didn't feel he deserved. They called the agreement historic. They wanted him to return for debriefing, medals, interviews. They spoke of promoting him, of making him the face of a new diplomatic era. But Daniel knew the truth. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He'd only remembered what others had forgotten. He replied simply, "Request to remain on station for transition period. Observer role still needed." Captain Cruz sent back a single line, "Smart choice. The real work starts now." That afternoon, Kelvor arrived on the station. He wore no armor, only a plain tunic marked with the symbol of his house, a shield cradling a star. He found Daniel near the main viewport, watching a Varelian cargo hauler dock smoothly beside a coalition freighter. "They work well together," Kelvor said. "They're learning," Daniel replied. "Because you gave them a reason to." Kelvor turned to him. "Before you came, we saw your people as clever, strong, dangerous. Now we see something else. We see the ones who stand in the fire so others do not burn." Daniel shook his head. "Not all of us, just one. Captain Nunez." "One is enough," Kelvor said. "A single light can guide a whole fleet through the dark." They stood in silence for a while, watching the ships move in harmony. Then Kelvor placed a small object in Daniel's hand. It was a smooth stone, dark green with a silver vein running through it. "This is from my homeworld," he said. "It is given only to those who restore balance. Keep it, not as a gift, but as a reminder." Daniel closed his fingers around it. It was warm, as if it held memory in its core. Over the next few days, the station became a symbol. News spread across both sides. On human worlds, people spoke of the silent surrender, how the fearsome Varelians laid down arms not because they were beaten, but because a human observer reminded them of an old debt. On Varelian planets, children were told the story of the shield bearer who returned, not with weapons, but with words. Daniel filed his final official report. He kept it clean, factual, focused on timelines, agreements, and technical details. He mentioned the cultural influence, the unexpected reverence, but he left out the legend. That wasn't for archives. That was for people. But in his personal log, saved only to a private drive, he wrote, "Sometimes peace isn't won by strength or strategy, but by a story someone refused to forget. We thought we were here to end a war, but maybe we were here to remember who we are." On his last evening aboard the station, Daniel stood alone at the viewport once more. The stars stretched endlessly in every direction, cold, distant, and different. Yet somewhere in that void, a small ship had once made a choice that rippled across decades. It hadn't changed the universe, but it had changed two civilizations. He thought about Earth, about the cities and families and quiet lives untouched by war. He thought about Varelian children who would grow up without knowing the sound of plasma fire, and he realized Perhaps your leaders forgot, Rel said gently, or perhaps they never knew. But we remember, and now you are here, a human, standing among us during a time of war. It cannot be chance. Daniel rubbed his temples. It sounded like myth, like something passed down through generations until fact and faith blurred together. But Vrel believed it, and Kaelvor believed it. Maybe the whole Varelian delegation did. Why tell me this? Daniel asked. Because you must understand, Vrel said. We do not fear your weapons. We do not respect your numbers. But we honor your sacrifice. If you say peace is possible, we will believe you. Not because you command armies, but because your people once gave everything for strangers. After Vrel left, Daniel spent hours searching his secure comms link. He requested access to deep historical logs, focusing on missing vessels from 80 years ago. Most requests were denied automatically, classified, outdated, or irrelevant. But after 3 tries, a file unlocked. Us Marlow Scout Class Last Contact, Sector V9 near Varelian border. Status lost with all hands. Presumed navigational error. That was it. No details. No heroic last stand. Just a footnote in a forgotten war. But Daniel cross-referenced the coordinates. Sector V9 matched the location VRL described, and the date within weeks of the so-called antimatter wave. It couldn't be coincidence. He dug deeper, using backdoor academic channels he'd learned in training. He found a declassified astrophysics report mentioning an unexplained energy absorption event in that sector, 80 years ago. The data was messy, but one line stood out. Anomalous shielding signature consistent with human-grade gravitic dampeners. The Marlow hadn't been lost. It had chosen to die. Daniel stared at the screen, his chest tight. Some officer, maybe a captain named Carter, maybe someone else, had seen a dying world and made a choice no one would ever thank them for. And now, because of that choice, an entire alien species saw humanity not as conquerors but as guardians. Back in the negotiation dome that evening, the mood had shifted again. The Varelians offered to share mining rights on KL7, something they'd refused for years. The coalition delegates were stunned. Lisa Ford kept glancing at Daniel as if he'd whispered secrets in the dark. During a quiet moment, Kaelvor walked over to Daniel's table. "You look troubled, Observer. I'm just trying to understand," Daniel said. "Understanding is the first step to peace," Kaelvor replied. "We do not surrender to your guns. We yield to your memory." Daniel wanted to say he wasn't worthy of that memory, that he'd never done anything brave. But the words stuck in his throat, because maybe it didn't matter what he had done. Maybe it only mattered what his people once did, and what they might still become. That night he sent a coded message to Captain Cruz aboard the Astreus. Request full logs on USS Marlow. All available data. Priority Alpha. He knew it would take days to get a reply, if ever, but he had to try. As he lay in his pod listening to the hum of life support, Daniel thought about the silent ship. No fanfare, no medals, just a single act of courage in the endless dark. And now that act was echoing across time, bending the path of a war. He wasn't just an observer anymore. Whether he liked it or not, he was part of the story, and stories, he realized, could be more powerful than weapons. The third day on KL7 began with a storm, not of wind or rain, for the moon had none, but of voices. Inside the negotiation dome, the coalition delegates argued in hushed, urgent tones. Ambassador Lisa Ford paced near the entrance, her face tight with frustration. The Varelians had gone too far, she said. Their sudden generosity felt like a trap, Why would a proud warrior race offer up key strongholds without a fight? It made no sense, unless they were planning something worse. Daniel Harris sat at his usual table, silent as always, but his mind raced. He had spent most of the night reviewing everything he knew. The story of the Yas Marlow, the Varelian legend, the strange respect in Kelvor's eyes. None of it fit the cold logic of war. But maybe war wasn't always logical. Maybe sometimes it was shaped by memory, by myth, by a single forgotten act of kindness in the void. He wanted to tell Ford the truth. But how could he? He had no proof, only whispers and old data fragments. If he spoke now, they might think he'd been compromised. Or worse, that he was making it up to justify the Varelians' behavior. So he stayed quiet, watching, listening as protocol demanded. But the tension grew. During the morning session, a coalition officer named Captain Reyes demanded the Varelians hand over control of the orbital defense grid around KL-7. It was a major escalation. The grid protected the moon from space attacks, and whoever controlled it held the upper hand. The Varelians had always refused to discuss it. To everyone's surprise, Kelvor didn't refuse. He simply turned to Daniel. "Observer Harris," he said, "what is your counsel?" All eyes snapped to Daniel. His heart pounded. This was not part of his role. He wasn't supposed to give counsel. He was supposed to observe. But Kelvor wasn't asking as a commander. He was asking as someone who believed Daniel carried the voice of the shield bearers. Daniel swallowed. "I cannot advise," he said carefully. "My role is neutral." Kelvor nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer. "Then we will wait," he said, "until the observer is ready to speak." The room fell silent. The coalition delegates exchanged confused glances. Ford's eyes narrowed. Daniel felt the weight of every stare, every unspoken question. He was no longer just a man in a uniform. He was a symbol, and symbols didn't get to stay silent forever. After the session ended, Daniel retreated to his pod. He activated his secure comms unit and checked for messages. Finally, a reply from Captain Cruz. The full logs on the Yas Marlow had been located. Not in the main archives, but in a backup server used by the Deep Range Exploration Division. The file was heavily corrupted, but enough remained. He opened it with trembling fingers. The last log entry was dated 80 years ago. Voice only. Static filled the background, but a calm, tired voice came through clearly. "This is Captain Elias Nunez of the Yas Marlow. We've detected an antimatter pulse heading toward Varelian homeworld. Origin unknown. Trajectory confirmed. Impact in 6 hours. No time to warn them. No time to stop it from here. But our gravitic dampeners can absorb the wave if we position correctly. It'll burn out the core, but it might save them. I'm ordering all hands to evacuation pods. I'll stay with the ship. If anyone hears this, tell them we didn't do it for thanks. We did it because it was right." Marlow out. Daniel sat back, stunned. It was real. Every word Vril had told him was true. Captain Nunez hadn't been lost to error. He'd chosen to die to save a species that wasn't even human, and no one on Earth had ever known. He read the transcript again, then again. Each time the weight grew heavier. This wasn't just history. It was a legacy. And now, by accident or fate, he was standing in its shadow. That afternoon he requested a private meeting with Kelvor. It was against protocol, but he didn't care anymore. He needed to know if the Varelians had the full recording, if they knew Captain Nunez's name. They met in a small side chamber away from the dome. No guards, no recorders, just the two of them. "You have learned something," Kelvor said. Not as a question. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I found the log. From the Marlow. From Captain Nunez." Kelvor's eyes widened slightly. "You know his name." "Now I do." For the first time, the Varelian commander looked emotional. His scales darkened at the edges, a sign of deep feeling. "We have kept his name sacred," he said. "In our temples we speak it with honor. But we thought your people had forgotten." "We did," Daniel admitted. "Until now." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Kelvor spoke again. "Why did you come here, observer, truly?" "To watch," Daniel said. "But maybe to learn." "And what have you learned?" "That peace isn't always about who has the strongest fleet. Sometimes it's about who remembers what matters." Kelvor nodded slowly. "Then you understand why we do not fear your weapons. We fear forgetting, and you have remembered." Back in the dome that evening, the mood had shifted again. The coalition was growing impatient. Reyes demanded an answer on the defense grid by morning. Ford warned Daniel that if the Varelians didn't comply, the ceasefire would end. War would resume. Daniel knew what he had to do. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a hero. But he was the only human here. And if the Varelians saw him as a link to Captain Nunez's sacrifice, then maybe he could use that. Not for power, but for peace. He spent the night writing a proposal, not as an official but as a man who had just learned the truth. He suggested joint control of the defense grid, half Varelian, half coalition, with neutral observers like himself overseeing operations. It was risky. It required trust, but it was the only way forward that honored both sides. As he sealed the document, he thought of Captain Nunez, alone on a dying ship, choosing to stand between fire and the innocent. Daniel couldn't match that courage, but he could try to live up to it. The next session would begin in a few hours, and this time, when Kael'vor looked at him, Daniel wouldn't stay silent. He would speak, not as an observer but as a human who finally understood what his... The interstellar vessel, Astraeus, moved slowly through the dark space above the moon KL-7. Its silver hull carried the marks of recent battles, scorch lines from plasma fire, patched hull plates and the quiet hum of overworked engines. Inside, the air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and old coffee. In the observation deck, Lieutenant Daniel Harris stood by the wide viewport watching the gray surface of the moon grow larger. He adjusted the collar of his dress uniform, smoothing out a wrinkle that refused to disappear. His hands were steady but his stomach twisted with nerves. He was the only human on this mission, not a soldier, not a commander, not even a negotiator. His job was simple: watch, listen, and report. Nothing more. He was a diplomatic observer, sent by the United Earth Coalition to monitor peace talks between the Varelian Alliance and the Coalition forces. The war had dragged on for 6 long years, burning through lives and resources across 3 star systems. Now both sides claimed they wanted peace. But Daniel knew better than to trust words alone. The Varelians were not like humans. They were tall, scaled beings with slit-pupiled eyes and voices that sounded like stones grinding together. They valued honor above all else, and their warriors wore scars like medals. Humans had fought them before and lost more than once. This ceasefire was fragile, held together by promises and the thin hope that neither side could afford to keep fighting. As the Astraeus entered low orbit, a message crackled over the comms. Observer Harris, prepare for surface transport. Varelian delegation is awaiting your arrival. The voice belonged to Commander Elena Cruz, the ship's captain and Daniel's only real contact on this mission. She had warned him before departure. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make promises. And for God's sake, don't smile. They think it's a threat. Daniel nodded to himself, though no one was watching. He grabbed his small data pad and a sealed diplomatic pouch, empty as per protocol, and walked toward the shuttle bay. 2 coalition envoys, both from the series Diplomatic Corps, met him there. They wore neutral gray uniforms and said nothing as they boarded the shuttle with him. Their silence made the trip feel heavier. The descent to KL-7 was rough. The moon had no proper atmosphere, so the shuttle dropped through vacuum until magnetic landing clamps locked onto the platform below. The ramp lowered with a hiss and cold, sterile air rushed in. Daniel stepped out first, blinking against the harsh lights of the landing zone. Before him stood a line of Varelian delegates. Their armor gleamed under the artificial sun lamps and their tails flicked slowly behind them. At the center stood their commander, Kael'vor. He was taller than the others, his scales a deep bronze, and a jagged scar ran from his brow to his jaw. Daniel had seen his image in briefings, ruthless, cunning, responsible for the destruction of 2 coalition outposts. But now, Kael'vor did something unexpected. As Daniel approached, the Varelian commander dipped his head slightly, not a full bow but enough to show respect. The other Varelian stiffened, clearly surprised. Daniel stopped in his tracks, unsure how to respond. Protocol said nothing about this. He gave a small formal nod in return, hoping it wouldn't be seen as an insult. Lieutenant Harris, Kael'vor said, his voice lower than Daniel expected, almost soft. You are welcome here. Thank you, Commander, Daniel replied, keeping his tone even. I'm here only to observe as agreed. Of course, Kael'vor said, but his eyes lingered on Daniel's face a moment too long. There was something in that look. Not suspicion, not hostility, but something closer to wonder. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold moon air. The group moved toward the negotiation dome, a transparent bubble built over an old mining facility. Inside, the air was warmer, and soft light filtered through the curved walls. Tables had been arranged in a circle with seats for both sides. Daniel took his place at a small side table, away from the main parties as his role required. The talks began quickly. The coalition demanded the Varelians withdraw from 3 occupied colonies. The Varelians countered with a request for full autonomy over the Kale system. Voices rose, gestures grew sharp, and the tension thickened like fog. Daniel recorded everything. Word choice, tone shifts, the way Kyle-Vor's claws tapped against the table when frustrated. But then, during a pause, Kyle-Vor turned to Daniel. "Observer," he said, "your people once stood between fire and the innocent. Is that not the way of humans?" Daniel blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean, Commander." Kyle-Vor studied him as if trying to see through his skin. "You do not remember," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he turned back to the table and the discussion resumed. Daniel's mind raced. What was that about? He had never heard of any such event in human history. Their records showed no grand rescue, no heroic stand near Varelian space. Yet the commander spoke as if it were common knowledge. Later, during a short break, a young Varelian aide approached Daniel with a tray of water bulbs. "The commander believes you carry the spirit of the shield bearers," the aide whispered, eyes darting nervously. "We were taught that humans do not fight for land or power. They fight to protect. That's not always true," Daniel said carefully. The aide tilted his head. "But it was true once, and that is enough." Daniel returned to his seat unsettled. He had come here to watch history unfold. Instead, he was walking into a story he didn't know he was part of. The Varelians weren't just negotiating with the coalition. They were watching him, waiting for something only he could give. As the first session ended, Kyle-Vor stood and looked directly at Daniel. "We will speak again tomorrow, Observer. Sleep well." There was no threat in his voice, only expectation. Daniel walked back to the shuttle, his datapad heavy in his hand. He had followed every rule, said nothing out of turn, done exactly what he was trained to do. Yet somehow, without firing a shot or making a single demand, he had changed the course of the talks, and the war wasn't over. But for the first time, surrender didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like something else entirely, something human. The second day on Kyle 7 began with a strange quiet. The usual tension between the coalition and the Varelians had softened, like a storm that forgot to break. Daniel Harris sat at his small table inside the negotiation dome, sipping lukewarm water from a sealed bulb. He had barely slept. The words of the Varelian aide echoed in his mind. "You carry the spirit of the shield bearers." What did that even mean? He was just a lieutenant with a datapad and a strict set of orders. Not a hero, not a legend. Yet the Varelians treated him differently. When he entered the dome that morning, their guard stepped aside without being asked. Their eyes followed him, not with suspicion but with something close to reverence. Even Kyle-Vor, the hardened commander, gave him a slow nod before the talks resumed. It made Daniel uneasy. He preferred clear enemies to confused admirers. The coalition delegates noticed it too. During a break, Ambassador Lisa Ford pulled him aside near the airlock corridor. She was a sharp woman with tired eyes and a voice that never rose above a whisper. "Harris," she said, "what did you say to them?" "Nothing, ma'am," Daniel replied. "I haven't spoken beyond basic acknowledgments." "Then why are they offering to pull back from Helios Colony?" "That's a major stronghold. They've held it for 3 years." Daniel had no answer. He only knew that the Varelians kept glancing at him during negotiations, as if waiting for his approval. It was as if his presence alone carried weight he didn't understand. Later that afternoon, while reviewing transcripts in his temporary quarters, a small pressurized pod near the landing zone, he heard a soft knock. He opened the door to find the same young Varelian aide from the day before. The alien scales were a pale green, a sign of youth among his people, and his hands trembled slightly. "Observer," the aide said, bowing his head. "May I speak with you? In private?" Daniel hesitated. Protocol forbade unsanctioned contact with the opposing side, but something in the aide's voice, the fear mixed with hope, made him step aside. "Come in." The aide entered and stood near the door, careful not to touch anything. "My name is Vrel," he said. "I serve under Commander Kyle-Vor, but I also study our histories. The old ones. What do you want, Vrel?" Vrel took a deep breath. "You do not know the story of the silent ship." "I don't." 80 of your years ago, during the Great Burning War, a human vessel came to the edge of Varelian space. Our fleets were broken. Our homeworld was exposed. An enemy, long gone now, wiped out by their own weapons, had launched a wave of antimatter toward our cities. Nothing could stop it. Our shields would have failed. Billions would have died. Daniel listened, frowning. This didn't match any human record he knew. Then, Vrel continued, a small ship appeared. No markings. No demands. It moved between the wave and our planet. It did not fire. It did not flee. It simply stayed. The wave struck it. The ship vanished. But the blast was absorbed. Our world was saved. Daniel's throat went dry. Are you sure it was human? Yes. Its final message was in your tongue. We stand so others may live. We recorded it. We teach it to our young. We call those humans the shield bearers. Daniel sat down slowly on the narrow cot. But we have no record of this. No ship was sent there. No mission like that exists in our archives.